Today I'd like to introduce my friend Bill Barnes. Yesterday was the 8th anniversary of his comic strip, Unshelved, about libraries. He has many books out about this comic strip. And 5 months ago, Bill started a comic strip about the software industry. It takes a special kind of person to understand his snarky one-liners, and he's lucky to have found me because I am one of his friends who does. I find him delightful. Please help me welcome Bill Barnes as he presents Cartooning in the 21st Century.
Oh, thank you. Kathy's been doing Toastmasters, so she's got the handshake. You always start with a handshake and you end with a handshake. I was a little nervous today because I quit my job in the software industry a little over 2 years ago to do cartooning finally full time. And it's sort of like when you leave high school and you go to college and you come back to high school, it's both sort of exciting but a little nervous. You're like, how do I fit in? Am I cool? Am I not cool? And I was worried about fitting in, and then I realized that I'm overweight, I have a beard, I own a recumbent bicycle, and I was up all night coding my website. So I do actually feel like I fit in here. So do we have, let's see, developers here? Developers? Do we have any testers? One tester. Marketers? Anyone marketers? Do you guys have program managers? No. So are anyone ex-Microsoft people? And so what is the sort of Google equivalent of program managers here? They work at Microsoft. Good. They're all the ranks of middle managers at Microsoft. I completely understand. So today I thought we would talk about, comics. I'm going to talk about what are comics and where do they come from. Where do they come from? I'm just more comfortable with a marker in my hand. And then I'll do a little bit of history of why I do comics and the comics I've done specifically, Unshelved and now not invented here, which is so long that it's just doomed to be abbreviated. So what are comics? Anybody? What is a comic? Someone define comic for me. By the way, if you're not here, this room is completely packed. A very short graphic novel, so now you have a recursive definition thing going on, right?
A sequential visual narrative.
A sequential visual narrative, nice. Will Eisner called them sequential art, which is very compact, and Scott McCloud in his book Understanding Comics, and this is always a mouthful and I have to look it up, juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and/or produce an aesthetic response from the reader. I think it is sometimes helpful to talk about what comics aren't. They aren't books. They aren't movies, although I think people often confuse them with animation. And they aren't pictures. They aren't just pictures anyway. So they're pictures arranged in sequence, and I think that's what everybody kind of agrees on. You can have one-panel comics. If things always exist on the periphery of whatever definition, you get this leaky abstraction problem with comics. But they're in sequence. And what I love about comics, and one of the reasons I do them, is this thing about what happens between this first panel and this second panel. In the first panel, somebody answers the phone and say, "What's that you hear? The bank is being robbed." And the next panel, Superman is sort of flying off into space. And your brain knows what to do. Your brain knows how to connect those two things. But is your brain doing the connection? And so you make a very personal, you inject your own personal experience of what exactly happened in between those two panels. I think we also see this, it's sort of a cut, right, like in movies. In the old days in movies, in the original movies, you had situations where somebody would be like, "What's that? You hear the bank is being robbed?" And he'd put down the phone, and he'd walk over, and he'd take off his shirt, and they would, cut away so you didn't have to see him getting undressed. But then you'd get back, and now he'd have his thing on, and then you'd see him opening the window, jumping out, flying through space, and then finally landing at the bank. Over time, movie makers have learned to make that more economical, and they've shortened it and shortened it and shortened it, until eventually now it is kind of that thing. "What's that? You heard the bank's being robbed?" And the next thing you see him landing, and your brain fills it in. Comics do that same thing. They're actually all about the cut and all about the stuff that happens in between. One of the big advantages of comics over movies is they're a lot cheaper to make. And so one of the reasons you see a lot of comics being made into movies is, in a way, they are a ready-made storyboard. right? Here, we've just laid it all out for you at very low cost, what it's going to look like. And so, and in fact, a lot of movie makers go back into comics because it allows them to, like, Joss Whedon has been doing Buffy season 8, because it allows them to do a lot of stuff they actually could never have done. He would never have had the budget to do very easily because he just draws pictures. So they're a little bit more than pictures. They're different than books, and I love books. I'm a huge book reader. But neurologically, you have a very different experience of comics versus books. Obviously, with books, there's descriptions of things. And with comics, they're just being laid out for you. But even there's kind of a continuum. And so you could describe, a tall, dark-haired gentleman walked in the book, and you think, oh, tall. You picture a tall, dark-haired gentleman, whoever that person is in your head. In a comic, that can take lots of forms. It can be, obviously, you can make him tall, but it could be as simple as that. We were having a talk at lunch about XKCD, where really you get even simpler than that. Right? There's your tall, dark-haired gentleman, and now you can project on that whatever you want, whatever that tall, dark-haired gentleman is. And the more detail you add, it starts changing it. Oh, okay, well, it's not that guy I was thinking of. It's somebody else. He looks something like that. And so for me, comics are a nice medium in the expressive thing. They're a very shorthand way of doing stuff. I don't have to say the tall, dark-haired gentleman. I can just draw him. And I actually have met people who cannot read comics. Neurologically, the juxtaposition of the words and the pictures are too much for them. And their brains sort of short-circuit and they can't do it. For me, it's almost the perfect thing. I actually get a little tired of reading all those words after a while, and so for me, having a little combination works. It also works with my sense of humor. There's some people who really want to tell a long story, and you can do that obviously with comics. I really just want to make a joke. If I could just go through my whole life cracking short jokes, I would do that. And so the comic strip is the perfect medium for that for me. Comics started, anyone familiar with the Yellow Kid? The Yellow Kid was sort of the first popular comic strip. He looked not dissimilar to this. I will sometimes do pictures, but I know this is going to go up on YouTube. And I don't want to use any copyrighted images. Yellow Kid in the late 1800s, in the New York, the New York World, Pulitzer's New York World, there was a comic strip called Hogan's Alley. And one of the characters was known as the Yellow Kid. It was just a little kid. He was like, 6 or 8, and he wore this nightshirt, yellow nightshirt, and he never spoke, but words appeared on his nightshirt to tell his story. He became hugely popular. There were literally Broadway musicals, a whole lot of merchandise, actually a whiskey with the Yellow Kid on it. And he became so popular that Hearst, who ran one of the competing newspapers in New York, I have to look it up, the New York Journal-American, hired the guy to come over and do the Yellow Kid in his newspaper to compete, which he did. But it turned out the man who wrote Yellow Kid owned the copyright to it, so he just hired someone to write a Yellow Kid for the newspaper he had been working at. So the Yellow Kid actually ran in both newspapers for several years. And it was essentially a big circulation war. They were trying to get people to read this incredibly popular character who today I think we would look at, and it's hard to find out what's funny about it at all, but in its time it was a big deal. And those became known as the Yellow Kid papers, and eventually the Yellow Papers, and that whole competition between the two and the things they would do to get circulation is now known as yellow journalism because of the Yellow Kid. There were comic strips before the Yellow Kid, but I think he kind of made it big and showed what everybody could do, and it was followed by Little Nemo and Slumberland and Little Orphan Annie and some comics that we've even heard of today. And somebody had the smart idea that if you took the newspapers that they're printed in, print a lot of newspapers on them, fold them over twice, and then slice down the edge, you could actually make a book of these comics. And that's the comic book, and that's where that word comes from. They're called comics because, of course, they were originally humorous, but rapidly what happened is people started telling different types of stories. Instead of just collections of comic strips from newspapers, they started having more original material. Instead of comic stuff, you had an explosion of genres. You had nurse comics, romance comics, war comics, and eventually superhero comics when Superman came out. Then in the 50s, and this was fine. So actually America had a very burgeoning comics industry. So did Europe, so did Japan. It was very popular. And then in the 50s, a guy named Frederick Wortham came along, and he revealed that comics caused juvenile delinquency, which we now know is caused by video games, but they didn't know that then. So, and what happened was there was this big freeze. There was a big Senate subcommittee on juvenile delinquency. He told everybody this. Oh my gosh, they imposed a thing called the Comics Code, which was a self-imposed self-censorship of the comics industry. And from that point on, there was a huge freeze, and really the only thing left in comics after this happened was the cleanest possible stuff, which was superheroes, characters of high morals saving people, and, Richie Rich and Archie and Veronica. And that's why, for a long time, comics were just for kids. And if you think about it logically, essentially what Frederick Wertham said is, he started off assuming, he said, comics are for kids. But look, there's all these comics that are written for adults, and kids are reading them, and it's bad for them. So let's get rid of these comics for adults, and then comics will just be for kids. So he did a nice little, tautological loop, and ended up back with what he wanted, which was for comics to be just for kids. And so sadly, this very flexible medium really was confined for a long time to just kid stuff. Over in Europe, over in Japan, comics are for everybody. Literally read by all ages, all sorts of genres. On the subway in Tokyo, you have businessmen reading businessman comics, or war comics, or whatever. They're just another medium. Finally, after a while, that started coming back into American comics in the 80s, especially the rise of the graphic novel kind of legitimized it. And now we have also influx of manga from Japan, comics from Europe, and it's kind of starting to go back to what it could have been. And even the term graphic novel is kind of a misnomer. It's not always a novel, it's not always fiction, but nobody has come up with a better word for it. And what happened to comic strips? Which has sort of started all this. Well, they stayed in newspapers. And as there were fewer and fewer newspapers and the newspapers got smaller, comics stopped being a thing they could use to expand circulation. They became just a thing that people would read. I think people still like reading comics in the papers, but there's probably very few people who would choose a paper over another paper because of the comics it had. And increasingly, of course, there's really just one paper to choose from. It doesn't really matter. And newspapers are primarily read by older people because young people be like, why would I do that when I can just go to the internet and read news? So you get this self-fulfilling prophecy. Newspapers are for old people. The comics in them are for old people. And so they're old. You look at comics and newspapers these days, with very few exceptions. They're very hackneyed. It's Beetle Bailey and High and Lois, and there's a few new things, but primarily newspapers are trying to retain their older audience, kind of desperate to hang on to them. And so comics have moved to the web. And so now anyone can do a comic. I mean, that's, the magical web thing. The barrier to entry is basically zero. Everybody has comics on the internet, really tens of thousands of them, and there are some really bad ones because anybody can do it. And so any 9-year-old can do it. Kathy has a 12-year-old who's working on doing it. Hers are very good. They're much better than most of the stuff on the internet. I'm trying to find a way to talk about this now. Yeah, so I often will look at comics on the internet and just be amazed. I mean, it's sort of sweet and it's sort of sad what people put up there and think is really funny, and it's just incredibly wordy, and the punchline is lost. And it just takes some time, right, to learn how to do this. And the other day I was going through my own personal archives, and I found the first few comic strips that I started writing when as an adult I started delving back into writing comic strips again. And it was every inch the really bad, beginner internet comic. And that was just 8 years ago, right? So practice makes better. I was just really struck by, oh well, I had nothing on them. A lot of times when people find out I do a comic strip on the web, they ask me why it's not more webby. Like, why doesn't it have animation in it? And I'm like, because then it would be an animation, right? And I'm doing a comic strip. I think one of the promises, or at least one of the theoretical promises of the web when it comes to comic strips, is you can kind of get rid of all the shackles and constraints of newspapers. They had newspapers, they wanted all the comic strips to be a certain format so they could line them up on the page. Well, that's not really a problem if you have a website. They can be color. Now, these days, some newspapers have color comic strips, but for the most part, they're still black and white. They can be color. They can come out as frequently as you want. You could do them 3 times a day. You could do them 3 times a week. You could do them 3 times a month, whatever you want, because you don't have a daily, cycle of the newspaper. And what's interesting is that most of the comic strips, and most of the popular comic strips on the web, look a lot like comics you would find in the newspaper. Generally, they're color. That's probably the one big change. And they might be a different shape. They might be more square than they are panels. But they're every day or several times a week. They are strongly resemble. It would be not out of place to put them in a newspaper, although the language might be a lot stronger than you find in a newspaper. I know the Penny Arcade guys were here a week or two ago. And so that doesn't really belong in a newspaper, but visually there's not that much different. And for me, all I can say is I think that literally like a century's worth of development of the comic art resulted in a vehicle that is ideal for communicating small bits of story and or humor in a very natural way. There's just something about getting something every day, having it be a certain size. I can't draw too much. I mean, I can't have this thing be enormous and delivered every day. That would be too much work. So it's actually how much work I can produce in a day, and also how much you can absorb in a day, and how much frequency. There's something very natural about that rhythm. So even though newspapers may sort of be going away, and the rhythm of newspapers may be going away, I think that will survive. So that's why I make comics. They're my sense of humor. They're the way I tell stories. I thought I would talk a little bit about kind of my personal journey, and it's interesting to see comics attract all sorts of people. I started off as a kid. I read a lot of comics. I read sci-fi, fantasy, blah, 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 but I don't think I ever would have been a person who made them. But when I was 8, my family up and moved overseas. We moved to Nigeria, where we got essentially in this little armed camp, because it was a dangerous place to live. And so my house had this huge fence around it with guards. And me and my sisters were kind of stuck at home a lot. And we burned through all the media we had. It was hard to get new media. This was in the 80s, and really there was one TV channel that had government-sponsored thing. They also had the Brady Bunch and Star Trek, which if I had to pick 2 shows to have, those would have been them. But even so, my media was limited. So we started making stuff. We started making our own stuff. It was very kind of Little House on the Prairie. We're all sitting around. I guess we'll have to like write our own stuff. It wasn't Little House on the Prairie in lots of other ways, but in that way it was. And so my sister and I started making our own comics. And in the beginning, they were incredibly derivative. Like, I would read The Avengers, and I'd write a new comic, and I called it The Avengers. But it had slightly different characters, and it kind of went, but that's how you do it. You take something modified a little bit and make it your own. So after living there a couple of years, I came back to the States, and I started publishing my own comic books. So I was, at this point, 10 or 11, and I would write and draw them myself. And then I started advertising the back of comic collector magazines and sort of newsletters. Buy my comic book. And people did. I mean, amazingly, I could say almost nothing about it. I'd be like, buy it. And they'd be like, okay. And they'd send me $5, and I'd send them a comic, which I would, photocopy in my dad's office. And then I said, wait, I can move myself up the food chain. So then I said, you know what? I need writers and artists for this comic book. And amazingly, people would send me stuff, and I would send them off scripts, and they'd send me back these huge, beautiful pieces of art that were better than I could do, and I would publish those in my dad's Xerox machine in his office, and sell those, and eventually at an actual photocopy place. And I did that for a few years, and that was super fun. But creatively, I kept moving back towards the comic strip thing, because the superhero thing was kind of fun, but they weren't actually, again, the stories that I wanted to tell that really moved me. I wanted to do much simpler stuff. It turned out what I really ended up doing that when I look back today is most me, was a comic strip about my dog. My dog's name was Barnabas, after the character in Dark Shadows, the vampire. And it was a comic strip called Barnabas the Wonder Dog. And it was really just about him and my family and our adventures, sort of slightly fictionalized. And I had the most fun doing that stuff. And so I did that for years through high school. Sometimes I would print it out for other people to see, and sometimes I would just do it on my own. And when I went to college, and then around this time I started discovering computers. And so I had this, what am I going to do? Especially going off to college, what are you going to do? And I had to decide, did I want to do computers or did I want to do art? And I decided to do computers. So I went to Carnegie Mellon and I studied computer science. And I had a lot of fun doing that. I did a comic strip in college for a while with a friend. And it turned out to be important because that comic strip I did in college is now the comic strip I'm doing today. It completely transformed and yet familiar. We were both in fraternities. We were in the 2 nerdiest fraternities on campus. Mine was something like 60% computer science majors. And his was equally high in engineers and stuff. And so we did kind of our version of what it's like to be really nerdy and yet in a fraternity. And it ended up centering around these 2 guys. And what we decided is they would be in the worst fraternity on campus. It only actually had them. It was just a 2-guy fraternity because everybody else had failed out. And so it was just them. But they couldn't tell anybody because if they found out that there was a fraternity on campus that only had 2 people in it, they'd get kicked off. And so they did these elaborate ruses. And they had a rush, and they got like 3 more people, which, exploded the size of their fraternity. But we kept coming back to the relationship between these 2 guys. And one was this guy named Bob, and he was more sort of the manipulator, and this guy named Dave, and Dave would do whatever Bob suggested. It turns out Dave had a substantial trust fund, which is what was keeping the fraternity moving. And Bob would take advantage of that. And I really liked the interaction of these guys. It wasn't perfect, but we played with that for a few years. And then that was the last thing I drew for years. I graduated college. I went off and worked at Microsoft. I did this opera thing for a long time. And years went by, and I got married, and I would always whine about this cartooning thing. I want to be a cartoonist. It's sort of one of my dreams. Everyone kind of has that thing they wanted to be. You know, I wanted to be a fireman. I actually did want to be an astronaut for a long time. But for me, it was always the cartooning thing, and I had really just abandoned it completely. I think I just said, well, obviously I'm not going to be the best at it, so I'm not going to do it at all. And I was whining to my wife about it, and she said, well, why don't you just, you know, start doing it? Just start drawing comic strips. I mean, you don't have to be in the newspaper. Just start drawing comic strips. I said, I don't know, you know, I do it once in a while, but I'm not really incented. So we developed an incentive program. And the incentive program is when we got married, we'd worked out our budget and what we were allowed to do and stuff. And we had this thing where I could get a new car every 8 years. You know, I'd been one of these Microsoft guys who got like a car every 6 months for a while. And I had to kind of get off that habit. It was not working out for me. I was addicted. And so I said, okay, I can stick with this car for a long time. The deal we worked out was if I drew a comic strip every day for a year, I could get a new car. At the end of the year, I would walk into a dealership and I could buy the car. And this was like the thing. This was the wedge that I needed. I just kind of needed that reason to get up and do it. And it was easy. And I didn't have to show them to everybody, but of course I did. And I had just this sketchbook, which I still have, which is the comic strip I drew every day for a year. And it was mostly about my life. It was some other stuff. It was fairly personal, but it was kind of a joke every day. And it wasn't always drawn well. It usually wasn't drawn in ink. It was just a pencil. But it was something I did that proved to me that I could actually write something every day. I always thought I was a guy with a sense of humor, and I always thought I'd do it. But there's a big difference between being a funny guy and actually writing a joke every day. And so I did that. And at the end of the year, I not only got a car, but I had an enormous amount of confidence about it. Because towards the end, it was really easy to whip it off. I'm like, what happened today? Oh, that thing. And it got very easy. So my confidence was much, much higher. And shortly after that, I decided to start a real comic strip. And so I did. And this was based on my wife and I's 9-month RV trip. I had quit my job at Microsoft, and we bought an RV, and we traveled around the country for 9 months. We visited 38 states, even a couple of provinces in Canada, 26,000 miles. And we had a great time. And it's a very strange sort of subculture of all these RV parks around the country, the people who travel, many of whom don't have homes at all. And it just seemed wacky and crazy and funny. And I started doing that. I worked on that strip for about 6 months, and it went nowhere. And I was really frustrated because it had been so easy to write this comic strip about my life. And really what I did is I was still writing about my life. I was just writing about my wife and I's trip. I hit a few road bumps. The first one I did was I realized that I could not have a character in the strip that had my wife's name, that looked like my wife, because if I had that character say something that my wife would not say, a complaint was filed in strong terms. And so I changed the character's face, changed her name, and immediately the complaint stopped. But the problem with that strip was it was this husband and wife traveling around in an RV. They were traveling around, and they would hit all these interesting problem situations, but there was no opportunity for a supporting cast. It was just the two of them, because they were always on the road. You would just get to know someone, and then you'd leave. By the way, that was what life was like, and that was probably the hardest thing about life on the road, was we didn't really have any friends for 9 months that we had steady contact with. And it was a roadblock. I've never resolved that. For a while, I tried adjusting the strip. I had the male character's ex-wife following him, like with her husband, because she always had to outdo him. So it was like she and her new husband, their even bigger, fancier RV, following him around. And that was sort of funny, and I have an ex-wife too, so I got a little chance to, vent a little bit in that. But it structurally was just not going to work. And it was around this time that one of my wife's best friends came back from teaching overseas. And this is the guy that we call Gene Ambaum. Not his real name, it's his pen name, but that's how I refer to him. And Gene had gone to library school and had gone overseas, found a wife, come back to Seattle, was settling in, and was starting to work in a library. And he came over, and he would tell these absolutely dark and awful stories about working in libraries. Because libraries are these places where everybody goes. I mean, literally everybody goes to the library at some point or another, often as kids, but we often go back as adults, especially if you have kids. Trust me, right now the libraries are full of unemployed people trying to find work or at least figure out how to file for unemployment. Everybody goes there, and so some very fine, upstanding citizens there, and some less so. And so he told me the story one day of the old man who was looking to relocate, and he wanted to find the state with the lowest age of consent. And that was one of like the sunnier stories. And I'm like, this is comedy gold. This is the sort of thing upon which a comic strip is built. And so we started talking about working together. I'm like, dude, you got to start writing this stuff down, and I will draw it for you. And it was going along slowly, and then we went to Comic-Con together down in San Diego, just to kind of gawk. And on the flight back, he's really scared of airplanes. And so to distract him, we started brainstorming the strip that would become Unshelved. And it was all about this one kind of hip young librarian dealing with stuff. And that strip from day one has just wrote itself, because it is the essence of a sitcom. It is a regular cast, which is these librarians, and also the regulars who come to the library, the kids, the adults and stuff. Plus, anytime I want to talk about anything. I mean, if I want to talk politics, I can have someone walk in and ask a question, look for help on something. And really, and from the second we started working this, I'm like, I can't believe no one else has ever done this. Like, how has no one else ever done this? And I just want, it's that thing when you've got like that great idea for the software product, and you just know someone else is working on it right now in their garage. And you want to get it as fast as possible. And I did that thing. So we kind of rushed it out there. And our plan was, of course, we wanted to go to newspapers, because there still were newspapers. But we knew we had some development to do. And so we came up with the idea that we'd put it on my website. And I'd done this a little bit with my other comic strip, to a very limited capacity. Rob, were you getting the first comic strip? Yeah. Old friend of mine. And so he was one of like the dozen people who read that first comic strip about the RV. So we did it again with what was then called Overdue. And we just started putting it out there 8 years ago, yesterday. And 3 days later, we got outed at a librarian blog. You know, there's a blog for everything, and there's a big blog called librarian.net. And it was one of those nice problems to have, because this was really just a research project. At this point, we didn't feel like we had our characters right. Absolutely, the art wasn't where we wanted it to be. But we wanted to put it out there just as a point of accountability. Let's get it out there, and my friends, my 40 friends and family will see it, and that'll be good. So we started putting it out, and days later, we got out in this blog. So we went from 40 readers to 1,000 readers overnight, and 3,000 by the end of that week. And now it's about 50,000. So that was great, except that we didn't kind of have a chance to do the research and development part of it. We just were there, and everyone was watching. Everyone was watching as we figured it all out. And I will say that it's gone incredibly well for that. That the characters we started off with, which were very kind of stereotypical characters pulled out of libraries, we managed to evolve them, and they've added some depth. The library audience turned out to be quite magical, and I think we planned a little bit of this, but most of it was kind of lucky. Quite magical because it's a very heavily networked group. So when, they all read that blog. When they find out about it, they all found out about it. The ones who didn't read it found out about it on a listserv the next day and so forth. And that's worked out very well for us. It turns out librarians also gather often. I think they're people who are unappreciated in their jobs, and so when they have a chance, they zoom off to a conference to hang out with other librarians and, complain about the people that they work with. And so we can go to a library conference and just buy a booth, which is a fairly expensive thing to do, but every single person who walks by is a potential customer. And so at the beginning, we would go to a library conference and literally sign up 1,000 people over the course of 4 days to read the strip, just by getting them to write their email name, and we'd add them to our email list and start delivering to them. And other cartoonists I know have comic strips that are broader, and I think much better than ours in every way. It's just that they can't go to a conference and do that. And one of my favorites is a comic strip called Sheldon, which is about an 8-year-old billionaire and his pet duck who talks. And it is really the most beautiful, heartwarming, funny thing. It's very nerdy, too. But there's just not that boy billionaire conference he can go to find his audience. Also, the Unshelved audience was very predisposed to buying books. And so after we'd been doing this just for a year, we decided to publish our first book. And we did it ourselves. We just found this printer up in Canada that gave us a good price. We just spun the big wheel, and we said, what the heck? And it's very expensive, comparatively, to not spending anything, which is what we had been doing. It's a big investment. We printed out 3,000 copies, but over the course of just a couple of weeks, even before the book went to the printer, before we actually had to write the check to the printer, we'd already pre-sold enough books from our audience to pay for the entire print run. And that pattern has happened ever since. It's all the stars were in alignment on that one. And I'll tell you, you go back and look at the books you have are our latest book, and I think I've actually become a pretty good cartoonist. But you go back and look at Volume 1, and it is pretty primitive stuff. It is not the worst stuff you'll find on the internet, but it is pretty primitive. I think our writing was actually okay from the beginning. We were both very concentrated in the writing, but I hadn't drawn in years. In fact, my writing had my drawing had taken a dip, and if you go look at my old stuff, you'd be like, wow, he used to draw pretty well. What happened? But practice makes better. And over the last 8 years, I've probably kind of hit that 10,000 hour mark that Malcolm Gladwell talks about in Outliers, which is where your brain sort of neurologically organizes around a skill in such a way. And I think I'm actually an expert cartoonist. Still not like anywhere near the best artist around, but good enough to actually tell the story, draw the characters, reasonably resembling what they looked like yesterday and stuff. But we were lucky enough to have an audience that kind of went with us on the journey, watched me learn to draw, watched me jump off the cliff and build my parachute in real time as I fell. After I've been doing the comic strip for a while, people said, well, aren't you going to do something about the software industry? And you worked there for like 20 years. And I wasn't even interested for a while. Like I've been doing, I was doing it for a while. I was doing both for a while. And the last thing I want to do is kind of take my work home and then do more of it. I kind of needed the escape from it. And I think I also, in retrospect, needed some perspective on it. It's very hard to look around at the stuff you're in and have any perspective. And I had left and then come back to the software industry. But as I was preparing to leave again, I actually felt I had enough perspective, and I started to spin up the next comic strip, which has become Not Invented Here, which we launched in September. And that was an interesting process. I started taking notes about these characters, and what I ended up doing is reaching back into that comic strip I did in college, the one about the two guys, because I liked their relationship. And so the idea I came up with, a very simple pitch, was about these two guys, and the comic strip has actually changed quite a bit from this, but these two guys who had started 4 or 5 companies together, and each one had gone down in flames, like horribly and terribly, burning every bridge along the way. And so they were stuck working at this IT company. And these guys, at least one of them was very talented. It wasn't clear about the other one. But they're a team. They always went everywhere together. And so they're working at some IT company. At one point, they were like in the IT department of a shoe company. It was just going to be the most banal possible place to end up as a developer. But they literally had no other choice because no one else would hire them or go anywhere near them. And then while they're there, they have the idea, and this is the one. Like, they actually had a good idea, and it's going to go someplace. But they couldn't do anything because they couldn't attract any capital. No one would go anywhere near them. So they decided to start the company from within the other company. And they were going to, which I know never really happens, right? But they'd be working at their day jobs, and like in their day jobs, they'd be working on the other thing. I even had an intern who was going to come work for their startup, but like on the grounds of the company they were working for. And I thought this was very clever and a good idea, and I still think it's a good idea. In retrospect, kind of an unmanageably complex situation for a comic strip. I think it would work for a sitcom, where you can explain a lot more. But it's too hard if you've only got 3 or 4 panels to establish the context of, are we talking about the company they're working for or the company within a company that they're working for? But anyway, this was the idea I had. And for a while, I was going to both write and draw this one. Now, Unshelved, I work with Gene, who writes it, and I end up editing a lot of his stuff, and then I draw it. And as I started spinning up this idea for the new comics, I thought, well, I could work with Gene again, and he could help me write this one. I'll source more material. And as I looked at it, I just didn't want to draw another comic strip. Like, the drawing has never been my favorite part. I like it fine, but I didn't really want to double my drawing workload. And Gene didn't really have anything to add in terms of the genre. Like, he didn't know anything about the domain. He's not from the software world. And so what I decided to do was to kind of switch roles and hire, or at least work with an artist. And so I started hunting around after I had developed the original idea. And I found a guy from Tacoma named Mark Malmux, who I really liked his stuff. He's an illustrator, but he'd done some comic strips, and I'd met him at some cartooning events. And we worked together for a couple of months, and he did some stuff that I really liked. And then after a while, we both were like, this is not working out, because he was a professional illustrator. And when you're starting something like a comic strip, it's a lot like starting a startup. It actually takes a lot of hours. You're not going to get paid for a while. You're kind of building up equity, and that's about it. I certainly couldn't afford to pay him for his time. And eventually he said, yeah, I can't put all this time into something that I don't know is going to pay for me and my family. And literally, we just had this conversation, and the next day I found out that one of my favorite cartoonists, a guy named Paul Southworth, he did a great comic strip called Ugly Hill, just beautiful, and so professional illustrators just loved this guy because the things he did were amazing. He was drawing that one to a close, and he had been doing some drawing for another artist, for Scott Kurtz, who does PvP. And Scott has a sort of side comic strip called Ding, which is about a bunch of people in World of Warcraft. So it's sort of the comic strip of them in World of Warcraft having their adventures. And Scott had hired Paul to draw that strip, and that didn't work out for some reason. And so Paul had just said, oh, I'm not going to do that anymore. And I jumped on the phone and called him up and said, you should come work on this comic strip with me. And so he and I started working together about a year ago, something like that, and starting the development process all over on this thing. And in doing so, he helped simplify this overly convoluted story about these two guys and their software company. And it simplified to just two guys working at some unnamed and sort of unknown software company. Became a little simpler and a little less epic and a little more conducive to the medium of comic strips. One of the things I thought I would do, if we can get our AV working, is I'll show you some development of the characters, or of one of the characters, Owen. There we go. Okay, so to back up, I started this comic strip in college. We made these two characters. They were called Bob and Dave, and Bob was actually the more clever of the two, and the more manipulative of the two, and Dave was the one who did all the work. And I basically liked this balance between the two. And as I developed this strip, it ended up looking a lot like the relationship between what at Microsoft we call program managers and developers. There's the people who say what to do, and then there's people who actually do it. So kind of went with that. And the development is that over time, the program manager character, who is now called Owen, became dumber and dumber and dumber, to the point where it's like, how does this guy remember to breathe? And then the developer character got very sort of, well, he actually got smarter because he became a better developer, but maybe simpler in the ways of humans, as some developers sometimes have challenges in those respects. She looks at her husband. So I thought I'd show you the development of Owen. So Owen actually starts off as I actually flipped the two visuals of the two characters. Bob went away, and the visual of Dave survived to become Owen. And he's a character I always like drawing. This is an Unshelved strip, which I'll read to you. I'm the smartest person in this library. Next to me, you are all intellectual Lilliputians. I need a book, but it's got to be challenging. And Dewey says, then let me show you the book on manners. And so this was the character who used to be Dave in the comic strip. And he just showed up here because I always enjoyed drawing him. I always enjoyed this little lip of hair he had, which is almost a hat, but not quite. And then, so as I started working and sketching on the new strip, I sketched in my sketch pad. And here's a page from my sketch pad, my Moleskine, of the character who'd become Owen. And he basically, guy with, and also he looked more and more like me, is what happened as I started drawing more. His hair started receding, and he got a goatee. And his eyes became very expressive. In Unshelved, most of my characters just have dots for eyes, but I really wanted to have a different look for the strip, a little bit more realistic. This is when I still thought I was going to draw it. So then after I decided not to draw it, and I started working with Mark, he did his take on it. We ended up with a different character design. Here's a couple of panels. And so our dilemma remains, rich client or thin client? Sir, if I may, I agree with Brooke Astor, who said you can never be too rich or too thin. And so that's Owen there standing up. And it turns out he was not invited to the meeting. That's the punchline of this strip. So Mark I actually like the simplicity of Mark's style, and it could not be more different than the next artist I worked with, Paul. So after Mark and I parted ways, I actually didn't show Mark's designs to Paul because I didn't want to pollute the waters. I just showed him my design. And he sent me back a bunch of sketches of Owen. And so character design is kind of what Paul does. He's really good at it. And I try to give him as free rein as possible. See, he took the very basic thing and did a lot of variations on it. And impossibly fast. Really, I mean, I could be like, Paul, I need a new character. 10 seconds later, he's just got it in front of me. Both his talent and his work ethic far surpass mine. So I think of all of these, the one that I personally liked, I'm looking at them now. Oh, it's funny because the Hawaiian shirt ended up moving over to Desmond, the other character. I guess the one I liked was kind of the bottom left and the upper left. So I took that. What's that? It does say butt chin, yeah. That's one of the options. He kind of has a butt nose now, actually. So I took one, and I took his sketch and I photoshopped it, and I made it look a little bit more like I wanted. So one of the things I liked is that he's sort of semi-well-dressed. Like, he's the guy who should be going to the meetings in a tie and stuff. He doesn't really take it very seriously. So he's just kind of got a dumpy, well-dressed look, and a hat because his hair is thinning, totally unlike mine. And I sent that to Paul, and Paul liked that, and he ended up refining it into this guy. And this is starting to resemble the final character. So his lines are all cleaned up, but the nose and the chin are about to change, because this is what it looks like now. And so that whole process took, well, I mean, in a way that process began 20 years ago, but that last part of the process took probably couple of weeks, at least to get to that point. And the first couple of, he drew a couple of non-invented here strips, which he then redrew later. In fact, we have two, I should have brought up it. We have two different versions of strips, and it's amazing how much the character design changed between them. And then he ended up with character design he was happy to start with, so we launched in September. And even so, you go back and look at the, and this is a guy who's been drawing his whole life. You go look at the strip in September 21st, which is when we launched, and a strip even just a few months later, and it's amazing how much the look of the strip has changed and the characters have changed. It's just something that happens, and I certainly notice it with my own work, that as I draw the characters every day, I start doing shortcuts and noticing the things that really work and don't work about the characters. And there's nothing, you will never get it right ahead of time. I actually think it's a lot like writing code. It's one thing to kind of plan out ahead of time, this is how it's going to be, and then when you get in the trenches on it, you start rounding the corners and figuring out what works and what doesn't work. So I'm really enjoying writing the new strip. I love Unshelved, and I don't want to in any way imply that there's anything wrong with it. I've been doing it for 8 years, and I still love the characters. And in fact, we're gonna shake things up a little bit in the next year. We're gonna have more things happen to the characters than have been happening. In part because we've been doing the strip for 8 years, and we need to make it a little more interesting for ourselves. But what's fun for me about writing Not Invented Here is a very different strip. It absolutely is a way to channel my experience of working in the software industry, which is a place I was never quite found my home in, but now I had lots of experiences there. I was a developer for many years. I was a manager. I was a program manager. My last job, I did user interface design. My last job was actually a speechwriter for an executive over at Microsoft because I enjoy public speaking and I'm good at taking things and figuring out how to talk about them. But it was infuriating to work with the 19 different marketing groups and stakeholders and try to figure out what to say. So that was just sort of life at a big company, or at least that big company. But it's lots of material. But the comic strip's not really about the software industry. It's really about these two guys and their friendship. And as I first started developing it, at first resembled the working relationship of myself and Gene, the guy who I write Unshelved with, because that's the working relationship that I have the most direct knowledge with. But what's really interesting is that the relationship between these two characters, between Owen and Desmond, the program manager and the developer, very closely resembles the working relationship of a writer and an artist. Like, scarily close. As I write these things, the metaphor or the analogy is very close. And so, very quickly, Paul and I realized that Desmond is Paul and Owen is me. I mean, I'm not quite as dumb as Owen, but the relationship between the two and the things they perform. And so, Owen goes to Desmond and says, well, here's this thing we're going to do, and I've figured out, here's the basic approach, and here's what I want it to look like. And Desmond's like, well, that won't actually work, but let me tell you what would work. And that whole thing is exactly like what happens when I go to Paul, and I'm like, well, I have this idea about how to do this, and I think it's going to look something like that. And Paul says, well, that won't actually work, but here's something that will work. And so the characters, we're starting to kind of write each character, not exactly separately, but Desmond is taking on more and more personality characteristics of Paul, and Owen's taking on more personality characteristics of me. And the program manager, developer, writer, artist relationship is what's coming to the front. And so that's fun, because I think not only is it fun to write, but I think it's fun to read something that feels real. And the more it is about the very true interaction of myself and my creative partner, the more it's not going to feel like some academic exercise in talking about software. Very quickly, yeah, so there's a sort of an obvious business model for this comic strip, which is to appeal to the people who work in software. But it's also a challenge because I don't want it to just be a comic strip for software industry. That would be thrilled if it became popular there. Because it's actually written pretty broadly. And even when they're talking about software stuff, you could almost have a word bubble that says gobbledygook here. And the people who, from outside the software industry, can just be like, well, I don't understand that word bubble, but I totally get the relationship. And that's how I try to write it most of the time. Try to drop in a few little rewards for the people who know what they're talking about. The same thing in Unshelved. Sometimes we'll talk about library stuff that I guess you have to be a librarian to understand, but very seldom. Most of the time it's just a background, and it just stays in the background, and that's my goal for here. So that is about all I brought to talk about. We have a few minutes, though, if anyone has any questions. Desmond. He has an unusual head design. It's true. And it is actually the most consistent piece of feedback I get from people is it took me a while to get used to Desmond's head. It looks something like this. And it's not exactly how people's heads are shaped, but I see going back to my original sketches for Desmond how this sort of came about, because my idea for Desmond is that his head would be the same shape as his body. And so my original shape was like this, which is more like a human head. And then his body would also be kind of the same. It would be like this, and then he'd have this big belly, right? Which sort of looks like a developer to me. And I think Paul went with that, and as he usually does, just kind of magnifies and makes things unreal. It's one of these things where if you get it too extreme a character design, the eye cannot recognize it as human. And I think Desmond is actually just on the edge. But I got used to it pretty quickly, and I just assume other people will too. But I think that design will probably evolve over time as well. And it wasn't actually a question you asked, but. Anything else? What's that?
Did you rush out at the right time?
No other. Yeah, there's been a couple, but nothing. No serious effort. There's one done by a library page called Turn the Page. Comedy writing is actually really hard. Writing a comic strip is hard. It's hard to if you try to be pithy on Twitter, you know what it's like to edit your thoughts down to the point where they fit in 140 characters or less, and it's very much the same skill as writing a comic strip. I was reading, I won't name names, I was reading a comic strip on the web the other day that was a little political thing, and it literally was this conversation. I think it was, how dumb is Sarah Palin? And the person says, how dumb is she? She's like, when she went out, she had, to speak the other day, she had written on her hands, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. Which is okay, it's not a bad joke. And the other character says, she's nutty. Oh, made me so sad. Why couldn't you just leave it there? But that's sort of that instinct and that sense of how to write an economy of words is just something you get by doing it a lot. Also reading. I mean, I've been reading comics my whole life, so I have probably a good sense of the rhythm of it. But again, going back to the stuff I was working on 8 and 9 years ago, it's pretty bad. It's amazing the number of words I would use to get across a simple concept. And so practice makes better. And so people who come out with something, I think they put it out and they instantly compare it to what else is out there, and it's not as good. They're like, oh, I guess I'm not good at it. And it's sad because they will get good at it. They'll absolutely get better at it. You just can't not get better at something if you practice it. But you have to stick it out, and absolutely with Unshelved, we were lucky enough to have an audience that was willing to stick it out with us and sort of pay us indirectly along the way.
So you mentioned that Unshelved started out as overdue.
Yeah.
So is there a story behind the name change?
There's an intellectual property problem, or potential one, actually. It's the sort of thing where it doesn't really matter if you have the right in an intellectual property. It's whether you can afford to have your lawyers prove that you have the right. There was a funny little short on the web years ago. It actually appeared on, I think, Cartoon Network, which was called Overdue, and it was a takeoff on cops. It was a librarian driving around retrieving overdue books. Overdue, boom. And that was it. It was just a title, and you can't trademark a title. You can try to trademark a title of an ongoing thing, but not of like a book or just a short. And so we thought, okay, that's not too bad. And so I called up the company. I actually found the company that made it, which is a little production company. And I explained the situation. They said, absolutely. We would sign whatever you want. We're never going to pursue this. And I said, great. We want to get our first book out, and we're just incorporating right now. And they said, great. Actually, it's just going to take a few weeks because we just got bought by Scholastic. And so it's going to take a while to worry that. And like the next day, we walked in and we said, we've got to change our name. and honestly, I don't think they particularly were going to pursue it or anything, but we just couldn't afford the risk. So we had a poll among our readers, and we had everybody send in ideas. We got like 500, 600 different suggestions, many of which were pretty bad, but some of which were really good. My personal favorite that we didn't do was shelf life, but one of the big advantages Unshelved had is it had an open domain name. So that will often trump other almost as good things. And for Not Invented Here, we went through a similar thing. Originally, it was going to be called Company Town because it took place in Silicon Valley, which is a town of companies. And then we found some stuff that was a little too close, and again, I couldn't get the URL for it. And so we brainstormed for a while and came up with Not Invented Here, and notinventedhere.com was owned by one of those companies that scoops up domain names and forces you to pay for it. And then somebody suggested that we get notinventedhe.re, which is an island called Réunion, French protectorate. And so we got that, and I eventually did buy notinventedhere.com from one of those companies. I think they got a little desperate as the economy got worse, and I got it for a reasonable price. Yeah, but absolutely probably the most frustrating thing of a new project is naming it. Because the names are important. And we wanted something that sounded funny, you know, and evoked something of it. And Not Invented Here is, like, in the industry, it's a great name. Outside the industry, a lot of people don't know what that means. And they just kind of do this. And that's okay, because they're probably not going to read it anyway. But as a name, I think it's superior to Company Town for evoking something about the strip. And it is kind of funny and also very appropriate for me, because I do everything myself. Like, I totally wrote my own blog engine and comic strip. I just rewrote my e-commerce engine. Partly because what's that?
So it's a hobby.
Well, I actually do it intentionally because I'm writing about programmers, and I feel a need to stay connected to what's going on. And like, I just did a cutting edge, you know, MVC application, and I actually sort of know what's going on with that now, which I wouldn't. So also, if this doesn't work out, it'd be nice to go back to my old job. So it's good to keep my skills going. Also, the other ones weren't good enough. It's the Not Invented Here thing. Absolutely, I looked around. I'm like, they don't have the exact perfect feature set for me, so I guess I'm going to have to write it myself. It was like the worst possible use of my time. So it's sort of an ironic name for me because it's all right. Well, thanks for coming out, guys. Appreciate it.